Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here today. I'm Megan Walsh. I'm a professor in the geography department. I also run our Cultural and Environmental Resource Management Master's program that we have here at Central Washington. I'm going to talk to you briefly about some of the research that I've done up at Mount Rainier. I'll jump into the goals here first. I started working at Mount Rainier in the high elevation environments back in 2011, really trying to reconstruct the paleoenvironmental history because this hadn't been done for the park. And so we were really targeting these high elevation areas, as you can see on the map over here, especially where these plus signs are, because those are the archaeological sites, or at least the ones that were known at the time when this map was made, that really show that humans in the past were using these subalpine environments because they were so productive. So we were really looking at specifically the fire and the vegetation history and thinking about how both climate and humans have influenced those things in the past. And whereas it's easy to understand that natural fires happen in these environments through lightning strikes, we also need to keep in mind that humans have been present on the landscape at Mount Rainier for at least the last 10,000 years or so. And they had many reasons to use fire as well, especially to encourage the growth of numerous plant species that responded well to fire, like the beargrass that you can see here and the vaccinium that you can see in the background here, or sorry, the blueberries and huckleberries. And so this is one of the things I work with in most of my research, is keeping in mind indigenous use of fire through time and how it might have impacted our landscapes. So we first started working in the Sunrise Ridge area over in the eastern side of the park. You can see the visitor center here and the Sunrise Overlook here. We targeted 3 lakes in our first study, which was Shadow Lake over here, Sunrise Lake, and then what we informally named Little Sunrise Lake down here. And then I'll mention the Sunrise Ridge Burrow Pit archaeological site here in a few minutes. So just keep in mind it's generally in this area over here. So again, very much up in the subalpine part of the park. The coring is certainly the most fun part of this research. It was definitely an adventure trying to get all of our coring gear. This is down in the little hole that Sunrise Lake sits in. You can see us anchored here in the middle of the lake, these big pontoons and the wooden frame on top of it. Lots of students helped. Other professors from anthropology helped us get sediment cores from these 3 lakes back in 2011. The idea with lake sediment coring is that whatever's going on in the environment, like fires that are happening, are going to deposit charcoal onto a lake surface, and pollen that's coming from plants is going to fall onto lake surfaces. It sinks down to the bottom and basically builds up in these layers. And we come along with these vertical tubes that we extend down from our anchored platform. Like you can see here, this is actually in Bench Lake. We have this PVC tube that's hollow, and we extend our coring device down through it, which is called a Livingston piston core. And we're basically like sticking your straw down into your soda. You put your thumb on the top, you can pull the liquid out. It's the same idea with the mud. And we go meter by meter by meter by meter, hopefully until we hit bedrock. We then take those cores back to the lab. We split them open. We segment them at very small intervals, 0.5 centimeters in this case for the lake cores that we got from the park. And then we radiocarbon date them, and we use all of the amazing tephra layers that were found within these cores to help date the mud, basically to make age models for our sediment cores. And so these were some of the most common tephra layers that we found. It was very hard to get through some of these. Some of them have like huge pumice bombs, like you can see with the Mount Rainier Sea here. Ruined some of my coring equipment, but it was totally worth it to get these sediment cores. And again, what I'm looking for and my students are looking for within these are both the charcoal that you can see here, woody charcoal and herbaceous charcoal that's coming from fires on the landscape, and then the pollen that's coming from the plants. And so we can reconstruct fire history through time and how plants and the landscape have changed through time. So I'm going to skip over kind of all of the method stuff and just take you quickly to the results since we don't have very long today. This is a pollen diagram, and the way to look at these, here's time down here. So here's 14,000 years ago. Here's present up here. Here's depth within the sediment core measured in centimeters. And then here are the different taxa that were identified through the pollen, and this is for Sunrise Lake. This was the longest of the cores we got, which ended up being about 14,000 years old. And I put some in red here. I put some of the common names in case you're not familiar with the with the scientific names. But what we see is captured in the Sunrise Lake sediment core is that we came out of the post-glacial, we're in the late glacial. At this point, it's still cold and dry, and so the landscape is dominated by trees like spruce and pine. But as we get into the early Holocene and it starts to warm, some of those trees then go away and we get a lot more alder on the landscape, a lot of disturbances at this time really indicating that kind of warmer change that came along with the early Holocene climate. As we move into the middle Holocene, though, after about 7,000 years or so ago, it starts to get cooler, it starts to get wetter, and we're getting a rise in species like fir that you can see here. Really whoever has their microphone if you could turn it off, that'd be great. Thank you. You can see this big rise in fir here, and then also this rise in western hemlock and mountain hemlock as well, really getting us to kind of the current forest that we have at this site today, which is really the coolest and wettest it's been since the last glacial period. So we take what we learn about the vegetation and we put it together with the charcoal, with the fire history. I'm going to skip now and just show you all three lakes. Here's Little Sunrise Lake, here's Shadow Lake, and here's Sunrise Lake. Again, Sunrise being the oldest of these. Here's time along the bottom, going from 14,000 years to present over here on the right. And the blue bars that you're seeing, the blue lines that you're seeing, are basically fire frequency that's been calculated from the charcoal counts by a statistical program that we use called char analysis. The black bars you're seeing here are basically kind of the magnitude of those fire events, and the plus signs up here indicate when fires were basically big enough to be kind of recognized as their own event happening through time. And so what you can see is that, first of all, the plus signs are pretty spread out from each other. Fires don't happen that frequently at Mount Rainier, but when they do, you can see by the size of these bars that they're pretty large stand replacing fires that come along. And they're happening every, 500, even at the beginning of this record, every 1,000 years or so. But as we move toward the late Holocene, over especially the last 4,000 years or so, we can see that there's quite a few plus signs for all of these sites. And so what I was able to calculate actually goes along really well with the tree ring studies that have been done in the park as well, is that no tree rings for a long time ago, but at the beginning of these records, we have fires happening like every 1,000 years. But as we get toward the late Holocene, the big fires are happening every 350 to 400 years or so at all of these sites. And what we know is that, again, here's the insolation anomaly for the Pacific Northwest. This is basically telling us that we're getting less sun as we go to the late Holocene, so it's getting cooler, it's getting wetter. But this blue graph down here is showing us that inso variability, so the difference between El Nino, La Nina years that we bounce back and forth between, that highly controls our snowpack and our temperatures. There's much more variability of that in the late Holocene. And so in this paper I wrote, we talk about how it's likely that it's that kind of flip-flop back and forth between kind of droughty years and not droughty years. During the droughty years is really where we're probably getting these big fires during the late Holocene, and why we have more during the late Holocene. What's really interesting about working up here is that we have lots of archaeology that's gone on for a long time. I'm working with Dr. McCutcheon from the anthropology department here at Central, and it's really easy to take what's found with the archaeology. This is from the Sunrise Ridge Burrow Pit site, and you can see that they have all of the same tephra layers that we have within the sediment cores, and so what they find in between these layers can actually be pretty accurately compared with our fire history records. And so we wrote a paper that just came out a few months ago that basically shows, as we get toward the last 4,000 years or so ago, when we're getting more fire on the landscape, when we're getting more climate variability, we see that we have the greatest technological diversity in those artifacts that are being found. Basically, what people are turning the stone tools into is more diverse as you move later in time, or closer to now, and also see lots of heat use within that. And so landscape was probably varied, probably had lots of fire on it, and they're making different tools to really utilize those landscapes in different ways. Last thing I'll show you here In 2012, we went back and we cored 4 more sites. I was able to use 3 of those. And so you can see here charcoal records with the fire frequency in red and just the charcoal accumulation in black. You can see for these 6 different sites, and there's a lot of fire at Mount Rainier. There's a lot of burning going on, especially at these 3 sites, and especially within the last 4,000 years. And the paper I'm writing now will talk more about human use of fire, especially in this last 4,000 years at some of these sites like Tipsu Pond, Reflection Lake, that have a lot of archaeological sites around them. I know I'm out of time, so I'll just run through this really, really quickly. But basically, I wrote a paper back in 2015 that showed, this is a synthesis of fire history records from 34 sites across the Pacific Northwest, not all mine, but a lot of them are, that show that a lot of the fire activity at many of these sites goes up during the late Holocene, which could be that insul variability, could also be increased human use of fire, which again, I talk about in many of my publications. So I'll leave it at that. I just want to say a big thank you, especially to Greg Burchard. He was the archaeologist for many years. He is now retired, but this is him helping us core Tipsu Pond, and he was actually in the Sunrise Lake picture as well. And we could definitely not have done this work without him. And I will just say thank you and ask if there's any questions. I got to get back to where I can see you.
Excellent.
There we go. Hello.
Yeah, so folks, you can put your questions in the chat or you can raise your hand. Thank you. That was so interesting. And seeing the archaeological stratigraphy and how that lines up with your data is so cool.
It's just such a rare case that is the case, that I see the tephras in my core and then we see it in the ground as well. And it's just this really unique situation. So it's been super fun to collaborate with the archaeologists.
Yeah, well, as someone in an archaeological park, I absolutely love that.
Yeah.
Let's see. Anik says, wonderful presentation. Thank you. Well, kudos to you. Oh, and we have a question from Jordan. She says, I'm wondering how far charcoal can travel.
Yeah, so I didn't have time to go into all the ins and outs of the methods of it, but we identify macroscopic charcoal. So the idea with looking at microscopic charcoal will show up on pollen slides, and pollen is very small. You have to look at it at like 400 to 1,000 times magnification. And the charcoal that's that tiny can come from all over, like 100,000, 1,000 miles away. Like fires burning in Australia, the charcoal will end up in New Zealand. That's not what we want to reconstruct. We want to reconstruct the local fire history. And so we're using pieces of charcoal that are 125 microns and larger. And plenty of studies have shown that those only go like 5 or 10 miles from where the fires are happening. So we have a pretty good idea that we're reconstructing local fire history. Now, granted, those fires are hopping around on the landscape throughout the watersheds that surround these lakes. But by looking at those bigger pieces, we really are reconstructing a local fire history. Great question.
And Camilo asks, did you hit basement with the core, or is there potential for deeper time record in these lakes?
We think for sure at Sunrise Lake we hit the bottom, because that's really what we know about the age of the retreat of the glaciers too. It's not exactly the same timing, but the lakes had to have a time to have the water fill in. Shadow, it seemed like it. We could not push it any harder, and I had about 6 people really, push it. It's all human driven. And so Sunrise, no, we only got to the Mount Mazama ash and couldn't get any farther at Little Sunrise. Same at Tipsu. Reflection Lake, we know we got to the bottom because we know the age of the Lahara that it sits on, which is about 7,000 years old. So Eunice, no, I don't think we got there. We just got to Mazama. So some of these ashes are just so hard to get through. You get through it once or kind of through part of it, and then your hole closes up and you just can't push back through it. Good question.
Well, thank you so much. That was so interesting. And if anyone has additional questions for Dr. Walsh, you can put them in the chat. And
I'll put my email there, and I'll put, sorry to interrupt, I'll put my my website there if anybody wants to see any of the publications on this. They're all available on my website.
And thank you again.
Thank you.
And